Hello, I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley.
And I'm her daughter, Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Heidi and I want to welcome you to Open to Hope Conversations, the podcast.
We believe that the greatest gift you can give yourself after a loss is hope, using this moment to connect with others who have not only survived but thrived.
So let's get started. Welcome to the Open to Hope show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we're going to have a really interesting show today because we're going to talk about sibling loss and sudden versus long-term illness. And this will certainly be an important conversation for everyone, whether it's a sibling loss or whatever, because we know that there are a lot of different issues in a sudden death versus a long-term illness. So Heidi, would you like to introduce our guest today?
Sure, I'd love to, Mom. And like you said, we'll be talking about sibling loss, sudden loss versus long-term illness. And we'll be talking today with Molly Fowkes, who is also a bereaved sibling. Molly lost her brother to brain cancer in 2014 after an 8-year battle. In 2022, Molly began working on the website Loss of a Lifetime. Go visit it. I've checked it out. It's wonderful. And Molly is a contributing author to the sibling anthology, The Loss of a Lifetime. Grieving siblings share stories of love, loss, and loneliness. So, welcome to our podcast, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me.
You said you were only 9 when your brother was diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah,
And how old was he, Molly?
he was 13,
He was only 13. What was his name?
Jimmy.
Jimmy. So, Jimmy's 13. You're 9 years old. He gets diagnosed with cancer. And then, how long was he sick?
He was in and out of remission for about 8 years.
That's a long time. So, I'm guessing he was in and out of the hospital, etc.
Yeah, definitely. There were some longer term stays depending on the type of treatment he was receiving or if it was, near a surgery that he needed to have. But I think the hospital at times definitely became our normal.
And I guess this is a question that we talk about and banter back and forth on in other shows. And that is, did you prepare yourself over those years for the idea that he might die, or was that not really a thought?
I think it was a thought that I generally pushed away. And partly because it was amazing that he was a kid battling this disease and the strength and the fortitude that he demonstrated really led the charge of our family. His attitude, we just kind of followed it. And I think up until the final months, maybe my parents would answer differently, but definitely as his little sister, it was just something I followed.
How did you deal with it?
I'm sure I had a lot of emotions. Um, I think this is something I talk with my therapist about. We're still unpacking all of the different emotions I experienced as a kid. But I think when your sibling is facing some type of disease, very quickly the spotlight is pretty much exclusively on them. And so for me, I was kind of put in this role of just doing whatever I could to make the experience easier for him and my parents. So as an adult, I'm definitely still unpacking those emotions that I likely experienced, but suppressed in a lot of ways.
It's interesting when you say that, considering the feelings of your parents. I think fast forward to after he died, I am sure that you were still considering the feelings of your parents a lot. I know Heidi talks about that with sudden death, how everyone wants to know how your parents are doing.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and then Molly, you have the extra added, I don't want to say burden, but kind of a burden of you got to be good. Your parents can't afford to have another sick child. They can't afford to have any issues. You've got a brother that's sick, and he sounded pretty amazing. Your story reminds me a lot of Elizabeth DeVita Rayburn's, whose brother was also like Jimmy, just a bigger than life, positive person. And he was the boy in the bubble, her brother. and he
Oh,
died.
yeah.
She lived in the hospital basically, but she talks about how she was kind of invisible
Mm,
and had to be strong for everybody else. And like my mom said, then when Ted died, and as you said, when Jimmy died, you still are in that role of I need to be strong for my parents. And I always say I was given the messages I need to be strong for my parents. And the worst loss that can ever happen is the loss of a child. But my parents weren't saying it. The world was whispering it in my ear, right?
exactly.
So
Yep. Well,
so
and
I'm
your point about kind of being invisible, the transition from when he was alive to when he died, him being my only sibling, suddenly all the attention was on me. And that transition was so jarring.
I bet. And again, Elizabeth talks about this too. I've got to connect you two. But I bet. So all of a sudden, everybody's looking at you and you're like, wait a minute, I'm not used to this kind of attention.
Right. Right. And then you add on the grief and you just, for me, I think I wanted to kind of self-isolate. And with the transition, that wasn't really an option. And so it was a really, I think, challenging first couple of years before I left for college, trying to just navigate being in the spotlight like that.
You know, the other thing, in talking to people who've had a long-term illness, one of the things that they tell me is that after the death, they're kind of out of a job in a way, and also the community that they've had when they've,
Mm,
the support they've got, the people that they saw at the hospital all the time, the activities, they had their routine of taking care of this person. Suddenly it ends
mm,
abruptly.
And if you brought in hospice, and I don't know if you did, you've got caretakers in the home. Or
right,
if people are sick, you've got caretakers in the home that become kind of like family in a way,
right. Yep, exactly.
a big
Yeah.
community, which became small very, very suddenly. I'm also wondering, did you expect Jimmy to die at the end, or once he took his last breath, were you surprised?
No, we knew.
Okay, so you kind of knew that this was it. I mean, you had some awareness. Did you start grieving before he died?
No. And I would say, I don't know how much grieving I did for years after.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's
and
pretty
and when
normal.
he died, it met me at a time in life where I was taking my standardized tests for college. I was in the middle of being recruited to play softball in college, which so much of my life, my goals were kind of building up to that moment. I was applying for college and um, there was, I think, an expectation of myself and an expectation of me to still be able to do this thing. And I think if I had allowed myself to grieve, people are really resilient. Maybe I would have been okay, but it seems hard to imagine that I would have been able to do those things while really opening myself up to grieve and acknowledge the loss.
So how many years after Jimmy died did you take your grief off the shelf and say, you know what, I need to unpack it, look at it, and deal with it?
I think maybe 3. It wasn't really until the summer after freshman year of college where I think I realized I had all these peers that were kind of being vulnerable, reinventing themselves as people do in college. And I realized I wasn't really being authentic with people because I was hiding this piece of me. And I decided, to be able to build meaningful relationships with these people that I really cared about, I had to open myself up.
Wow. That must have been powerful. I'm thinking about, I know some people have told me that after their sibling died, they had to almost be a super achiever. It sounds
Yeah,
like you were a little bit more in that realm where you had your baseball and you were really gonna, show the
yeah,
family that you were okay and that you were gonna super achieve and.
Well, and
yeah,
everything's on you now. You're
right,
the last person standing. I mean, you're your parents' hope. You're your parents' child that's still here.
right. Yep, exactly.
I think one of the things that's really important for our audience is to hear, and I hear this a lot with siblings, it's never too late to go back and examine our losses. I mean,
Hmm.
I was 20 when my brother died, and I definitely shelved it for years because I was trying to be a normal 20-year-old. Like I was trying to push some of it away. I didn't want to get too into it because I was afraid I would not be able to do what I was needed to do, which is, go to college, get a job, on and on and on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's pretty normal to say,
Yeah.
well, I kind of put it on the shelf for a few years.
Yeah. I totally agree. It's not really been until the last couple of years where I feel like I've really started to engage with my grief, and also just been exposed to more grieving siblings who have expressed the same sentiment. Because for a long time, I think I compared myself to not necessarily siblings who had lost their siblings, because I just didn't know that many, but anyone who was experiencing grief and seeing them engage with it pretty close to when they lost the person, and thinking to myself, like, why can't I do that?
Mhm. And now you're involved with a sibling anthology, right? Where you wrote a chapter, and it sounds like there's a lot of siblings that have written different chapters.
Yep, exactly.
I
What is
love
your,
that.
what's your chapter about?
That's what I was going to ask. I love it.
Oh, so mine is about, um, I think one, the timeline of grief, as we've talked a little bit about, or the lack thereof. And when Jimmy was diagnosed, we were living in Lake Oswego, Oregon, which had been our home for 10 years before moving to California, just before I started high school and he started college. And um, the transition of being with our community, who knew all of us so well and knew us before he was diagnosed and throughout a lot of his cancer journey, and then being in this environment where we really didn't have a lot of community in the local area, and the challenges around that for all of us, especially after he died.
So how long after he died did you move?
Um, it was before we moved in 2011 or 12, and he died in 2014.
Okay.
So a couple years after
Yeah.
before he died.
But he was also in college, and so like the friends that I was making at the end of middle school and beginning of high school, they didn't really know him or meet him because he was away.
So he really had his healthy times and
Mhm.
then he would have a remission.
Yeah.
Is that how it went?
Yeah.
So
Hmm.
Molly, I'm wondering, for people out there, what advice would you give somebody that has just recently lost a brother or sister?
Acknowledging that it's going to be hard and it's going to be lonely. Um, and especially in those first couple years, there were a lot of people who supported us, especially in that first year. And there's kind of a buildup, it seems, to like the anniversary of when they passed away or the first birthday. But after that first year, people kind of fall off. And I don't know that any of us were expecting that, because how could you? It's your first time doing this or navigating grief like this. But I think I wish someone had told me. I wish there was someone around who was honest about the challenges of the experience. And I would have maybe been a little more equipped to navigate just how lonely it was at times.
So the loneliness was the main thing.
I think so. And maybe it's partly because I was young when he died, and there are fewer siblings who are grieving their siblings at a young age.
How old were you again when he died?
I had just turned 17.
Okay, yeah. Well,
It
that's a
is
big, you said.
it is a lonely experience. I was 20 and I was very much alone.
Yeah.
One of the things I do I teach some graduate classes at Columbia on grief and loss. And one of the activities I do is I have all my students on the outside of the circle, and I step in the middle and I say, if you've had a sibling die, step in the circle with me. And 9 times out of 10, I'm alone. Most of the time, I'm alone.
Mm,
So it is because my students are all in their 20s. They haven't had brothers and sisters die.
right.
It is a very, very lonely experience. And I love what's happening on the internet right now with organizations and with things like what you're doing with your website and You know, the Compassionate Friends has a TCF Sibs page. There's also a Sounds of the Siblings Facebook page so that people can get support virtually because it is a lonely experience.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's been 11 years since Jimmy died, and only in the last 2 years, I think, have I really started to find sibling specific resources. But prior to that, I was just kind of, I mean, I was looking on the internet trying to find local groups, but really struggled to find anything.
Mhm. So tell us about your website and your book and Loss of a Lifetime. Um, and anything else you want to tell us about the work you're doing at Anderson?
Yeah, so Loss of a Lifetime was really started by Lynn Shattuck. But I work with Lynn and Allison Shelton. Um, and I was introduced to both of them through my mom, actually, and it was in just our initial very casual conversations where we all bonded over talking about receiving the question, "Do you have any siblings?" and the challenges with trying to answer something like that. Um, and through our conversations, just realized we don't really have a place or community to turn to. And so we had talked about trying to build that community through this website, and also aggregating resources so that they could hopefully be housed in a single place. Because I think the three of us all experience getting on the internet and trying to find resources and them being rather scattered. And so hopefully if we can put them all on our website and make them a little bit more available to people, um, people who have lost a sibling won't feel as alone.
Well, any last piece of advice for the grieving world?
Heidi, I really like what you said that it's never too late to go back or to start. I think that's something we've talked about in our group a lot this past year, and something I've experienced. I think Lynn and Allison talk about that as well. It's never too late to start, and no, grief doesn't have a timeline. So I encourage anyone to engage with it in ways that they can, whenever they can, but there's no shame in starting whenever you're able.
I love it. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on our show today and for all the good work you're doing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, Molly, thank you so much. And thank you for building awareness for sibling loss.
Of course.
And Heidi and I want to thank all of you for joining us on our show today. And we always want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.
I'm Dr. Heidi Horsley. You have been listening to Open to Hope, the podcast. You can follow Open to Hope on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To learn more, visit us at opentohope.com and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe.
I'm Dr. Gloria Horsley. Join us again next week for another Open to Hope conversation, where we invite you to lean on our hope until you find your own.